Good morning. Oh, come on. Good morning. One more time. Good morning. I really needed that. There's plenty of seats in the front up here if you want to kind of see me breathe. Just kidding. I'm Sandra Jackson Dumont. I'm the chairman of education here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to say a few words and kick off the morning. How many of you are from New York City? Just really quickly. Oh, okay. Woo! So if I say how many of you are from Chicago, somebody has to scream. How many of you are from Chicago? Woo! Okay. Now I need to say how many of you are from Detroit? How many from California? I was born and raised in California, so we always go wild. How many from Washington? I lived in Washington. Let me just name all the places I've lived and we'll just go on forever. Anyway, welcome everyone. I generally don't read, but I'll read a tiny bit just to kind of stay wholly on message. But I'm supposed to also welcome you not just to the Met, but also welcome you to New York City. But I don't think most educators need that much of a welcome because we make home wherever we go. So it is an honor to be here with over 300 museum educators from across the country. Each person in this room plays a critical role in nurturing equity, inclusion, and diversity within and beyond their museums. A huge thanks to NAEA, Museum Education Division, for creating a space for us to come together, and the 20+ museum educators from across the country that stepped up to lead sessions in the galleries this afternoon. So I've been involved with NAEA in the past, but I know any good NAEA or any good arts education organization has groups, committees, subgroups, phone calls. So really, thank you to the 20 powerful for being engaged. The theme is diversity and inclusion, as you can see here. When it comes to diversity and inclusion and equity, I've had to practice a higher level of self-reflection, professional accountability for myself, and institutional critique. But anyone who knows me knows that I practice a high level of all those things. And I say that particularly in this moment because, honestly, the arts education field hasn't always reflected me. But the people that we serve definitely has reflected me. And so I've had to tell myself and other people that, okay, wait, what is my accountability around this? If the people that we have programs for are extremely diverse and we talk about, and I mean economically, I mean able-wise, I mean in terms of ethnic and cultural background, all that stuff, why does our field still not reflect a high level of diversity? So something is up with our pipeline, right? And then me working at a place leading education here and having had several roles as director of education at different institutions, I have to ask myself, did I make a hiccup? What exactly is going on that the path from our programming, which we speak so aptly about being a seeding ground and a planting ground for the field, why aren't people making it into the profession? And so I've also had to tell people that education departments writ large have been doing this work for decades despite not having the requisite support. I mean, we have been doing this work for a very long time. At one point, it used to be also called community programs. Remember back then? Now it's called social practice. Don't get me started, but women, people of color, artists of color, people of color, professionals, have many of them that are also dealing with difficult materials often credit their entry into our field through education, through public programming. Many artists have seen their first project realized in a major institution through education. Many museum professionals have seen themselves come into the museum field through education. Even curators have come through education, many of them. In fact, I believe that more directors should come from the ranks of educators. This is where you scream. We know how to pull at the heartstrings. We know how to tell a story. We know how to balance a budget when there isn't one. We know how to make a closet into a studio. We know how to make a walkway into a processional. We know how to do it all. Yet we are oftentimes the last programmers and educators that people look to for directorship. Why is that? And so over the past few years, the Met has been engaged in deep thinking about these issues. Our efforts have included a leadership team at the highest level that's dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is led by the president of this museum. Our lead counsel is on this committee. I'm on it, other people are on it. A new mission statement in 2015 that places users, as opposed to visitors, users of the museum at the center. The Metropolitan Museum of Art collects, studies, this is our new mission, conserves, presents significant works of art across all times and cultures in order to connect people to creativity, knowledge, and ideas. And our vision is to create the most dynamic and inspiring art museum in the world. I'm sure that's everybody's vision. We've also developed a museum-wide commitment to connecting to a broader audience, a more diverse, broader audience. And an emphasis has been placed on making the Met responsive and relevant by serving as a platform for timely issues. Could we, right now, can we say that's important? And deepening our presence, not only in this institution, but beyond the walls of this space. And so I'm excited to know that right now in this place where we are really in a moment of transition, not just because of the news that came out yesterday, but in general, every museum is in a moment of transition because we're trying to figure out how we should be reflecting and grappling with what's happening in the world, using our own platforms as a vehicle for those discussions about the dynamic exchange of ideas. And so I'm looking forward to hearing and learning ways that you all are doing it across the country. And hopefully we'll be able to contribute just a little bit to that conversation, because I'm actually resolved that there is no best practice, but there are really great practices. And hopefully this is not positioned as the safe space or a safe space, as I don't think any museum is the safe space or a safe space, but they're safer than many places. And so I'm really excited, and I think everyone here is really jazzed about hearing what people are doing and stealing a little of your ideas and taking them home with them. So thank you so much, and thank you for allowing us to be the host for today. You all are exceptional human beings, and don't let anyone tell you you're not, because you all do the most amazing work, and you're not a service group. Don't get me started. You actually are creating this environment that allows all the work in the institutions to kind of pulse in ways that are pretty exceptional. So I'm going to pass the mic on to the next person, but thank you for giving me a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Sandra, for welcoming us to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And how incredible is it to start the day here today? This is phenomenal. Thank you. I'm also going to read just to help me stay on track here. So on behalf of our wonderful New York City hosts and members of the NAEA Museum Education Division Development Committee, welcome to the 31st annual pre-conference for NAEA's Museum Education Division. And we are thrilled that you're here with us today. My name is Michelle Grohe, and I have the honor of being the NAEA Museum Education Director-elect, and I'm also the Assistant Curator of Education and School Programs at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I am very happy to be here today to see many old friends, looking forward to making new ones, and to learn, as Sandra was just saying, from all of you and our amazing attendees today. I'm gonna move forward here. So I'm sure a lot of you looked very carefully at every single thing that's happening today, and you know exactly where you need to be at every moment. But I wanted to take a few minutes just to point out a couple of things. Often people think the pre-conference is created by one or two people, and it's not. This particular pre-conference was created, I would say, with over 50 active members really working passionately for it. And I wanted to point out a couple of, we have many museums that are hosting us today. So we're starting at the Metropolitan Metropolitan Museum of Art. We're going to end at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and then you can see up here all of the others. We have the Museum of Arts and Design, the New Museum, the Frick Collection, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, the Rubin Museum of Art, the Children's Museum of the Arts, the Studio Museum in Harlan, and the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Each of them have been instrumental in making this day a reality, and I would like to thank all of them for their hard work and dedication to today's success, and please give them a round of applause. And I hope that when you were looking through, I'm sure some of these names are very familiar to you, and I hope you, even if you're not going to one of these sites for your breakout, that you consider exploring them while you're here throughout the week. I would also like to take this opportunity to recognize and thank those museum educators who served on the planning committee for the pre-conference and those who are facilitating gallery teaching and afternoon breakout sessions today. I know that we are all looking forward to learning a lot as we work on through some of these topics today. And if everyone presenting or even leading a reflection could stand today and be recognized by your peers, that would be great. So please stand if you're awesome. It's just a handful of people. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Emily Holtrup, the director of the NAEA Museum Education Division and the director of Learning and Interpretation at the Cincinnati Art Museum.
Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to see old friends and meet new friends and just be in this environment. I also, we are doing a lot of applauding, but there is one set of applause that really need to happen, and that's for Michelle. She has really masterminded a great day for all of us. And on my behalf, to the team of educators who worked on various teams to give shape to each part of the day, you guys are amazing. Having planned those past museum ed directors who have come up and said, hey, how you doing? I'm like, I didn't have to plan today, so I'm doing great. So, but Michelle has done an absolute great job, and I thank you to everybody. Last year, about 100 educators gathered in Chicago for our annual Conversation with Colleagues, a very informal discussion where you helped to identify issues that were important to you. Diversity inclusion was one of those topics. It's been one of those topics for the last couple years, and I'm personally excited to spend the day reflecting on that topic with all of you. I'll keep these short and want to note some important things that are happening over the next few days. The leadership of the division has been working on 3 main priorities over the last 2 years: fostering community and ongoing learning through peer-to-peer and viewfinder initiatives and social media work, advancing research through our national IMLS-funded impact study, and opening up opportunities for leadership by making the process of participating in our division easier. And if you're interested in participating in the division, find either one of us. We would be happy to work with you. In your folder, you will find a flyer listing all the museum education sessions that the division has organized for the membership. One of those highlights is the Conversation with Colleagues that is taking place tomorrow, Thursday at 1 o'clock. So please come out and join us. We want to hear your voice, and it is a really great conversation. I also want to call our attention to the awards ceremony. For the second year in a row, we will be working with the other divisions to do a big celebration. So please come out and celebrate your museum education awardees. They've done such amazing work, and it's great to see friends in the audience cheering you on at those events. And speaking of contribution, they've contributed so much. Could I ask the development committee to wave or stand up or give a little high sign if you can see them? Please give them a big round of applause to all of them. We talk a lot during the year, and it's so great to see them in person because I hear their voice on a regular basis, but it's great to see them in person. And they have worked so hard to bring a new level of relevance and dynamism to our division. And my deep, deep thanks to all of you as well as to Michelle for the interest in advancing our collective work and your involvement in this organization. You guys are rock stars, so thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to highlight a few things and talk about the theme, and then I'm going to turn it over to our keynote speakers. So every year, as we were saying, We get feedback from all of you in terms of what you enjoyed about the pre-conference, what you would like to see in the future, and we really listened. This particular theme we've been working on for the past 2 years, and it felt like New York City was the best place to address it. And so what I'd like to do is encourage you, you will get a link to a survey for the pre-conference after today, probably next week. Please fill it out and give us your candid feedback. We can only make the division as strong as working together and including having your honesty about what's working, what you would like to see moving forward. We'd also like to remind you that there's plenty of time today, both during the lunch break as well as the break between the afternoon breakout sessions. I'm saying break a lot. There's a lot of breaks. Because we want you to have time to talk to each other and network, spend that time with each other talking informally, because we hear year after year that that's something that's really crucial for a lot of you on a day like today. Please also notice in your orange folder there's a list of restaurants near the Whitney. So grab a new friend, grab an old friend, and head closer down to the Whitney if you're going to the reception later today, and continue that networking over whatever food or beverage works for you at 4:45 in the afternoon. And then you're seeing over here, we are, as Emily mentioned, we're very active in social media, and we do that on purpose. So we have 375 of us here today, and we're here to work and talk to each other in person. It's one day out of the year. So we're really working on social media to keep those networks and connections going throughout the year. We have a very active social media committee that's led by Heinel Epley, who also worked on this handout. So this is a half sheet. If you're new to social media and you're trying to figure out how it works, this is in here as a reference. We have our own hashtag NAEAMusEd17 that we're using not just for today, but throughout the rest of the convention. And NAEA has the broader hashtag of NAEA17. We also have these fun white buttons that you picked up on your lanyards, and that has the hashtag IAMMuseumEd. IAMMuseumEd is a hashtag that we use throughout the year. We use it to share different parts of our stories and things that we really enjoy or maybe are struggling with in our work. We use all of those, particularly on Twitter and Facebook, and I know some of us are starting to use it on Instagram as well. So I just wanted to point that out. And then lastly, we encourage active social media participation, but remember that we're going to be having different conversations today, and some of the topics or what we discuss might be sensitive, or someone might be sharing something that's quite personal at their own institution. We encourage you to share via social media, but if you're taking a picture or you're quoting someone directly, just check in with them about if that's okay with them, because we want this to be a space where we can come and talk with one another honestly and openly, and they might be sharing something about what's happening at their institution that they don't want publicly tweeted or shared. So just something to keep in mind. And then I'm going to transition now for the theme of the day. Illustrations to, yeah. I worked really hard on this slide, so. So I did. It was a lot of work. So the 2017 NAEA Larger Conventions theme is Challenge of Change. And when we saw that topic posted, our division really thought, well, we want to ask ourselves, how can I be a lever of change? What can I do to leverage and to actually proactively make change happen in our own work? And I wanted to point out a couple of things. Not a surprise, but cultural institutions are increasingly adding diversity, equity, inclusion, and the word community into their strategic plans, their mission statements, their goals. While these ideals require us all to think deeply about all of our various identities and social relationships, a thorough understanding of the historical and contemporary dimensions of race and racism in museums is particularly relevant at this moment in our country. With the changing racial demographics, the emergence of movements such as Black Lives Matter, and the increasing social media focus on the intersection of race and museums, there is a clear call to examine how race influences our work in museum education. Before we can start to address these initiatives on behalf of our institutions, we must pause and take a closer look at ourselves and our own lenses our own beliefs, our experiences with race, and how they affect our programs and our interactions both with museum visitors, works of art, museum spaces, as well as our own colleagues, both within our departments and throughout our institutions. This year's pre-conference will help us have a focused exploration of these different ideas throughout the day and rethinking how we can be effective change leaders in our institutions. This work and paradigm shift is hard, and yet it is of utmost importance if museums are to evolve to be more open, affirming, and inclusive spaces. Our pre-conference is designed to be an opportunity for art museum educators to self-reflect on the lenses and perceptions that we use every day, establish brave spaces to have these difficult conversations, and outline concrete steps that we can take individually and as a field to make our work more diverse and inclusive. So in a moment, we're going to start with our keynote speech, but I wanted to highlight a few more things that are happening. Afterwards, we're going to go into the galleries and examine best practices, where someone will demonstrate and you'll participate in an experience with a work of art. There's plenty of time to reflect on that, both in what happens during that experience and also thinking about connections to your own work. Regardless if you're someone that's in your museum teaching every day, I think we all have something to learn. Those groups were determined randomly so that you can interact with folks that you may or may not converse with throughout the day. Then you have the lunch break. And in your letter, in your envelope that you received this morning, it tells you if you're in lunch group A or B. There's 2 pickup times. There's 12:45 to 1:15 or 1:30 to 2. That is back downstairs in the URS Education Center where we started. There are also opportunities to explore the museum while you're here. There's the Memory Palace podcast that you can check out. You can Google it, you can look it up, in the American wing. And then the education department here at the Met selected a group of books that you can explore in the Nolan Education Library that is also downstairs near where you will pick up your lunch. Grab your lunch and find a seat, or if you want to take your lunch to go, it's up to you. If you're in one of the further away breakout session spaces, you are probably in lunch group pickup A. And then we will go into breakouts at our various museums throughout the city. So that was something that most of you made a selection of what topic or speaker you wanted to listen to. Then, as I said before, there's a break where you can network and socialize with each other. And then I hope you will join us at the Whitney Museum of American Art from 6:30 to 8 for an exclusive after-hours closing reception as well. And when you come to the reception at the Whitney, your orange lanyard is essentially your ticket to get in. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back to Emily to introduce our keynotes. Thank you all so much for being here and for participating today. It's great to see so many people here, so thank you. Sorry.
Oh, we're good. It is my absolute honor to introduce our keynote speakers today to give us our address on how can art museum educators work for racial equity. Today we'll focus on race. To remain relevant, 21st century museums must seek to align their practices with democratic values and change how they connect with people and their diverse experiences. How then do we create spaces and experiences for visitors and colleagues who have not been historically represented or acknowledged? As museum educators, we have responsibility to do this. Keonna, Hendrick, and Marit Dewhurst will provide a historic overview to issues of race and racism in the context of museums, define shared terms for us to use as a field and throughout the day, establish structures for having conversation and nurturing brave spaces, and model a few strategies to address real-life issues in the museum workplace. Dr. Marit Dewhurst is the Director of Art Education and Assistant Professor of Art and Museum Education at the City College of New York. She has worked as an art educator and program coordinator in multiple settings, both nationally and abroad, including community centers, museums, juvenile detention centers, and international development projects. Her research and teaching interests include social justice education, community-based art, youth empowerment, and the role of the arts in the community development. Her book, Social Justice Art, A Framework for Activist Art Pedagogy, was recently published by Harvard Education Press. Keonna Hendrick is a cultural strategist, educator, and author who promotes critical thinking, expands cultural perceptions, and supports self-actualization. She is the co-founder of SHIFT, a collective of cultural workers engaging anti-oppressive feminist professional and personal development. She is also co-director of, multicultural critical, I just lost my track. She is also co-director of Multicultural Critical Reflective Practice, a professional development model. Keonna continues to provide professional development to educators in museums and classrooms nationally, including Arts Conception, Brooklyn Museum, Museum of Modern Art, New York City Museum Educator Roundtable, and the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. Please help me welcome them to the stage.
Keeping Keonna on her toes. So thank you all for coming out today. Marit and I are very grateful for having the opportunity to really focus today our conversation on race and equity in museum education. It's something that we're both very passionate about, and it's something that we know that you all, being here today, are very interested in and want to work towards. Now, as we get into the conversation about diversity and inclusion, these are broad topics. I've even heard people recently talk about them as buzzwords, so to speak. But I want to iterate that these reflect language that we are using to describe experiences of marginalization, experiences of exclusion, in order to help us think about how we can alleviate that type of oppression that people who are living on the margins are experiencing daily. And so when we think about diversity and inclusion, it involves a number of things around our identity politics and social issues, including gender, age, education, socioeconomic status, religion, or sexual orientation, and even body type. But for today's purposes, as we said before, we are focusing on race. And one of the reasons why we decided to focus on race is because for some reason it seems to be a very scary topic for people. It's one of those topics that people sometimes assume as passé and that we've moved beyond. However, it's at the foundation of much of our national culture and much of the work that happens in our institutions. So, we are going to continue to dig deep into this today, and I'm going to ask you guys to really start to think about how our discussions around race intersect with our conversations around other points of our identity. Because as we start to see that once you start talking about race, you have to start talking about sexual orientation. You have to start talking about gender. You have to start talking about socioeconomic status and class and nationalism and immigration. All of these topics permeate with one another, and we can't alleviate one or at least start to fix the problems within one without talking about the other.
Great, so here's the plan for today. We're going to spend a little bit of time this morning thinking about this idea of why we're even talking about racism. So you've heard Emily and Michelle talk about this a little bit. Keonna set up the scope of our conversation, but we're going to drill down a little bit more into why this should matter for us as museum educators, thinking to what Sandra said as our role in this field. How can we really focus and fine-tune our understanding of racism and how it's enacted in our lives? So to do that, we're gonna go through some strategies with you. One is we're gonna build a common vocabulary. So we're gonna start talking about the terms that we use together and what makes sense, and what we really mean when we say racism, when we say privilege, when we say prejudice. Then we're gonna move into thinking about how we apply those terms to our everyday examples. How do these things play out? We'll start looking at how can we analyze what's going on when we're in the moment of experiencing one of these racist moments. And then we're gonna think about, okay, well, how do we start disrupting that? How do we take action, both internally and externally? So thinking about some of that self-reflection and then moving outwards towards our programming, our audiences, our colleagues. All of that's going to actually force us to realign our values and really think about what we care about, why we're here, what we're really committed to in this field. And then we're going to spend the rest of the day practicing it. And and beyond the rest of the day, you're going to go home and continue to do this. So we're getting everyone on board for this. So as we think about this, I want to take a minute and, as Michelle pointed out, we've got 300, almost 400 people in the room, right? People are coming from all over the country. So what I want to do is take a minute to just get our minds all sort of in some similar shared space around these concepts about race and racism in our work. So let's just do a quick poll. And I just want you to do what you can to bring your brain like really centered into this conversation today. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. And as you're raising your hand, maybe take a look around and just kind of take a mental poll of what you're seeing. So how many people have talked about race at work in the past week? Raise your hand. Raise them high, because it's kind of dark in here. Nice. Okay, great. How many people have already talked about race today? All right, nice. It's early in the morning, but I've been up for a while. So, how many people have recently mentioned race while teaching? You're in the galleries, you're leading a program. Great to see a lot of hands, great. How about in a casual conversation with colleagues? Maybe over lunch or walk through the galleries? Okay, great. How about with a supervisor? Okay.
Ooh, good.
A board member?
Nice.
Yeah. How many people in here feel really, totally super comfortable talking about race at work? Like, easy breezy, you can do it all the time. Okay, take a look around. How many people feel, well, maybe not so comfortable or confident talking about race at work? How many people feel that they wish the conversation would just go away? Great. Well, what I want you to do is, again, think about what you've noticed just in that quick poll, right? And think about where we are as a field, where you are as an individual. And what you might have noticed is that we're all coming from really different places. People have different levels of comfort and confidence. People have different modes of talking about race. People sometimes talk about it early in the morning. Sometimes people wait until the afternoon. But no matter what, it's important to notice that we're all coming to this day together from really different places. And that's important, because that's going to help us move our conversations in really specific and transformational ways for everybody here. So now what we would like you to do is think about how we move that conversation forward together. So coming from all these different places, coming from our different comfort levels, some people in this room have probably never really had to talk about race before. Others talk about it all the time. That's fine. We're going to move this conversation together. So no matter where you're coming in. So with that in mind, I want to start off with a story. Welcome to the Keonna and Marit show. Part of why we're here today and why we were delighted to be invited today is because we've started having this conversation between each other and between our colleagues and friends. And this really started with the non-indictment of Darren Wilson after the murder of Michael Brown, and how that intensified the national conversation around racism, policing, and the safety of Black people in our communities. The nation watched as protesters and law enforcement officers faced off in Ferguson, Missouri. Artists were responding, museums were responding. Many of our own institutions started to grapple with this question of, well, what is the museum's role in this national conversation, this national movement to honor how Black lives matter in our lives, in our world? And a lot of museums started to struggle with what is our position in that? What are the boundaries? Are there boundaries? Is this our role? What's our responsibility? And we listened and watched as a lot of our colleagues started to take stances. Maybe they started to develop programs around that. There were panels, bringing in artists, really being explicit in their teaching about race and racism and how it connects to the arts and how it connects to cultural production. Other colleagues weren't so sure. And we started to notice that there was also a silence that was starting to develop. That a lot of people were saying, well, maybe this isn't the role. Maybe museums should be neutral. So we started to see this happening, and it concerned us. Keonna and I spent a lot of time talking about how upset we were about this paralysis we were noticing. And so what we did is we thought, well, what if we just brought together a bunch of our friends and colleagues and started the conversation ourselves? So in August of 2015, we put out an email and we gave people about a week's notice, thinking maybe we'd get 8 to 12 people who would join us for a 2-day workshop on race and racism in museums. And within 36 hours, we had 40 people signed up. So we couldn't cancel, and which I had kind of been hoping we would. So we went ahead with it, and actually the conversation led us to realize how important it is to really be talking about the concepts of race and racism together as a field, to support each other in ways that are unique to our own identities and unique to our experience as museum educators. So since then, we've done many additional workshops across the country and with colleagues here in many different institutions.
And one of the things that we found kind of surprising and doing some of these workshops and some of the writing is that people are often surprised to see Marit and I together as a white woman and a black woman talking about race so openly and often disagreeing in public. And we realized that some of that surprise actually comes from a place of anxiety around having this conversation. And so people are feeling nervous or anxious about what to say and how to say it. In addition to that, there's a lot of questions about when is it appropriate to talk about race? So maybe it's not appropriate when I'm talking about it at work, or I should just keep this conversation for my family discussions, or never at the dinner table or Thanksgiving, because that'll ruin the experience. So there's this idea of like timing there, and if people are breaking certain social codes if they initiate the conversation. The other thing that we noticed was that people were really starting to have a sense of confusion about silence and neutrality, and understanding that, well, I don't have to, if I'm silent, then maybe I don't have to just deal with it at all, and I can walk away from the conversation, from the issues at hand, and stand in a neutral place. And so often, whether it was in a workshop or in the workspace, we would encounter these experiences and folks trying to understand, oh, how then do I, as someone who wants to have the conversation, start to break the silence? And I think that's important for us to really think about today as far as how, if we're going to be levers of change, how do we break our own silence around the conversation around race and racism, and how do we help our institutions break their silence wherever those quiet spaces are when these issues come up? So I'm going to ask everyone today to really consider, how can you be a lever of change within your sphere of influence when it comes to creating anti-racist spaces? All right?
Great, and the first way to start thinking about how to answer that question requires us to come to terms with a couple things. The first is the reality that racism is real. It's actually a thing, and it permeates every part of our interactions with each other. Our friendships, our work relationships, what jobs we apply for, what jobs we are hired for, the audiences that come into our institutions, the histories of our institutions. Every single thing in the United States is permeated by the concept of racism. That is the absolute thing we need to acknowledge before we even move further. Because racism is at the foundation of our institutions and continues to influence our daily practices, we have to be aware of how our institutions don't just exist on their own, but are actually made up of individuals, right? We all come here, and on our name tag it says, we're from this institution, right? And yet it also has your name on it. Right? So we're individuals within these institutions. And so we are contributing to those institutional ways in which racism is perpetuated. The positive part of that is that we also have the power to disrupt it then. As individuals, as individual levers of change, you have the agency to start putting some sticks in the cogs of the great machine of racism, and to start changing your practice, changing your ways of thinking, so that we can start to dismantle this overarching disease in our society.
And so what that might mean for us is shifting our conversation about objects to a conversation around people and care for those people. I think it was Emily who mentioned earlier, and so did Sandra, about the change in our cultural and political systems. Right now, we have students, I'm sure a lot of you can agree with this, we have students who have a lot of anxiety about their family safety and their safety in schools. We have parents who are concerned around their ability to support their families and the futures of their children. And as museum practitioners, we really have to think about how do we situate our work in a broader context of our culture, of our nation's culture, and the changing policies that are impacting that culture. So whether we think about restrictions on immigration, or whether we're thinking about the policing of Black and brown bodies internationally and nationally, and also thinking about creating safe spaces, physically safe spaces for queer and transgender youth and gender non-conforming youth to live in their personal truths. We have to consider how can our work help shift the narrative so that we have a new normal, so to speak, a new normal that allows everybody to participate and live in their own truth. And so with that, we have to consider race. And I know some of those issues consider gender and nationality and religion, but again, if we come back to how the language around those conversations has been racialized and codified, to start to think about groups of people who are being marginalized based on their physical distinction, then we really see how these groups of people are starting to be racialized in a way that starts to perpetuate those same systems of oppression. So with that to say, our silence is not going to save us in museums. It's not going to stop the anxiety that our students are bringing with them inside of, from the schools into our institutions. And it's not going to save us from having to deal with the conversation or deal with the realities of the oppression of racism. And also with that, then that means that there's no inappropriate time to talk about race or racism. Every moment, every injustice that we see is the appropriate time to start to dismantle and unpack that and to reveal a new possibility for seeing ourselves and seeing others. And then finally, just to reiterate, that takes a lot of hard work. It takes hard work, it takes patience, and it takes thoughtfulness, and most of all, I think, care and love for ourselves and for each other to work through some of that murky area of language and shifting our values towards an anti-racist practice and culture. So, as we do that, we start to have to think about what is that going to mean for our cultural institutions? How do we start to set a new vision for that work?
And so when we're thinking about what anti-racist work is, so now we're starting to shift towards thinking about how we do disrupt these systems, we need to start to think about the stories that we each bring to our work, right? We talk a lot in museum education about stories, about the kinds of narratives that artworks tell, that artists tell, that we tell, that our audiences bring, that we co-create together. And we have to think about how those stories make us who we are, and how in analyzing and understanding those stories, we can better understand each other. And so that we can start to think of how we move from thinking about these stories to listening to them as a call to action. And thinking about our work as anti-racist educators becomes a call to action of everyday practice, of analyzing these stories and really embodying what they mean for us as individuals and as societies. So with that, we're going to cut now to the business part, right? Where we start talking about strategies. You've got the lay of the land, you've got a little bit of sort of our story, and now we're going to start to think about what does this look like for us as practitioners in this field? Oops, sorry. I don't think we need the other one.
No. Okay. So our first step is to build a common vocabulary. So anybody, just by show of hands, ever had the situation where you want to talk about race, but you're headbutting with each other because you don't have the same language, and you realize you're just having multiple conversations, right? Mm-hmm. It becomes challenging. So the first thing we want to ensure is that people have a common ground so that they can understand where they're coming from and better hear each other in these challenging conversations. So we're going to just introduce a couple of terms that you might find useful today and that you can carry with you to your institutions and work with audiences to start initiating. And all of these terms, we've looked around, we've started to distill them a little bit to something that's more palatable for folks of any age to start to understand and unpack, but they're all based on sociological, psychological research and historical foundations of understanding the history of race and the history of dissecting race through racism as a study, okay? So the first two are diversity and inclusion. Those are those buzzwords I talked about before. So a lot of times people use those words interchangeably, but they really aren't the same. So diversity really is a variation or difference in characteristics of an individual or group. And so sometimes when we talk about diversity, we think, if we look around this room, how different all of us are. You guys come from different spaces, you work in different institutions, different tastes probably, different backgrounds, languages you speak, or even just general preferences and styles. Now, we are a diverse group here. When we look at inclusion, this is when we move beyond the aesthetics of diversity into the actual practice of shifting towards equity. Okay? And so that's putting diversity into practice through involvement, respect, and connection between individuals and groups. So that means taking all of the richness that you guys have from your backgrounds, your opinions, and your perspectives, and allowing you all a seat at the table to share those ideas in a fair and just way, and to have an impact in decision making. Okay? If we move further with that, then we start to see that each of us has a certain amount of privilege. Now, privilege is advantage based on social identity. So there are some parts of our identities where we maybe see more privilege, and others where we see we are have no privilege or less privilege as well. So for instance, if I look at myself, as a US citizen, I have a lot of privilege in this country. However, as a woman, because of the history of patriarchy and sexism, my privilege is a little bit shaky there, all right? But it doesn't negate, one doesn't necessarily negate the other. So it's important to understand that within our own selves, parts of our identity are sometimes at odds with each other as well.
Yeah, so then moving through these, we start to see how these play out in our interactions with each other. So oftentimes we'll hear young people confuse the ideas, young people and people of all ages, confuse the ideas of prejudice, discrimination, and racism. We'll get to racism in a second, but let's pause for a second and look at what prejudice and discrimination actually mean. Prejudice is really what it means. It's prejudging. So it's when you have an idea of what somebody's going to behave like, or you have an assumption of how they're going to do, just based on the fact that you know they're a museum educator. You know they're from Michigan. You know they're from, fill in the blank. You move that prejudice into discrimination when you combine it with an action. So when you take those thoughts in your head and then you act on them, you're like, well, I'm not going to talk to them. Or, well, I'm going to assume that they're not going to talk about this. So that's when we actually get into discrimination. One other term that's important to know before we move into racism is this concept of power. So power, and this one's a really hard one to distill into a PowerPoint slide, but the idea with a power is that for today, we're going to go with the idea that it's the control of or access to resources, decisions, definitions of reality, and the capacity to act. So if you have that, then you have power. So now, when we're thinking about racism, and this is where I think often we, as colleagues and people in our society in general, often stumble about what are we really talking about when we're talking about racism? What we've found is it's helpful to break this down a little bit, to look at the nuance of it. First of all, racism is the idea of race prejudice plus power. So prejudging based on your racial identity, race prejudice, plus power. Access to control, access to reality, control over decisions, right? Now those come out in a couple different ways. One, we might experience that as individual or internal or internalized racism. That's what you think about or do to yourself. So for example, that might be in my confidence and entitlement in thinking that I should apply for any job. as a white woman, I'm pretty confident that this field reflects me. I see some white people here. So I know that it's highly likely that, like, I deserve to be here. These are my people. Easy breezy, right? So with that comes the idea that my voice is worth hearing in every meeting, every teaching situation, every conference. You should listen to me. And I start to think about that. So it contributes to a sense of superiority. Now, I don't like to think of myself as someone who has a superiority complex, but this is because I have been trained in a society to believe this. So this superiority thing going on in my head is part of my internalized view of whiteness as being in a position of power. So moving to the next one, what happens then when you take that internalized sense of racism, my internalized superiority over people of color, and I start to interact with people? What happens then? Oh, Keonna, you have something to say? Actually, you know, I have a better way of saying it. Let's do it this way. And actually, you know what? I think it would be really great if we, maybe I could just be in charge here. Because, I think everybody gets me. So that is an example of the interpersonal racism, where I start to think, well, I can speak for both of us. My narrative is good enough. I know, Keonna and I are friends. I can speak on her behalf. So then you start to think about how that plays out into institutions, right? So who we're hiring. If I'm going to a job interview, or I'm hiring somebody, I'm going to be really impressed with somebody who talks like me, right? Oh, you went to the same school that I did? Oh, that's great. All of a sudden, we start to see how my views of my white superiority are replicated in who I'm hiring, in the ways in which I'm teaching, in the artworks I'm choosing. Right? So that's when it becomes institutional.
And sometimes that idea, if we switch out superiority to familiarity, and think about how do we privilege our familiarity, and when our familiar is steeped in race or steeped in our cultural points of reference, then we start to see how we create that hierarchy.
And that gets really important then when we start to think about the systemic and structural racism, right? So now I'm hiring people who look like me, or who've been vacationing in the same places that I vacation, or use the same slang words that I use, many of which are related to my own whiteness. And once I start to do that, maybe my other colleagues at other institutions are doing the same things. And so all of a sudden we start to have these shared codes of what's acceptable in the field, right? And what that does is that starts to limit whose voices are heard here, right? And so then those shared codes become sometimes spoken and sometimes more often unspoken structures that prevent people of color from accessing power. Right? So you've heard me say a couple of times in here this concept of white supremacy. So Keonna and I often use the term white supremacy and racism interchangeably. This is because white supremacy explains what racism is. It's the belief that whiteness is superior. And it influences all of us. This is not just for the KKK. We are all living and breathing the air of white supremacy right now, and have been for many years. So this is something that for those of us who are white, there are many people who I've encountered who are like, no, please, Marit, I swear I'm not a white supremacist. You know what? We live in a culture that teaches us that we are better than other people. And so until we recognize that, we're not going to be able to dismantle it.
Cool. So let's go to step 2. And we should remind you that this is not linear steps. This is cyclical. So when we think about putting these acts into practice, we have to think about continuing to come back to them, each one, over and over again as we move through the world. So what we're going to do now is really think about how these examples of racism manifest in our work in museum education, and start to really analyze them a little bit, understanding where they come historically as well. So just, go ahead and you can raise your hand if you've heard any of these before. She's just not fit for the job here. Or why can't we find any qualified person of color for this job? Or it doesn't seem like you're prioritizing this job enough. Or how about, here's a work by a Black artist named Jacob Lawrence. Here's another work by a famous artist named Henri Matisse. Yes. So we've all heard these statements, and sometimes they're told as microaggressions or subtle aggressions or examples of racism. But they all manifest in our workspaces, and it's so casual sometimes. But imagine if you're hearing them often, daily even, what impact they might have on our sense of self, either a sense of superiority or a sense of inferiority. And so what Marit and I have done is we found that examples of racism really break down into 3 distinct categories: our interactions with objects, our interactions with audiences, and our interactions with institutions. So let's go through each interaction, and then we'll give you a couple examples of how that interaction manifests through a racist lens. What we'll do is pick out I'll give you one example and give you a little bit of background about it. So if I start here with interactions with objects, a basic one is choosing not to teach from works by artists of color. So sometimes it's very easy to do this, especially if you get a request from an outside community member, maybe it's a teacher or a group leader who's saying, I want to see these works and that work, and those are the most important things in your collection, so I need to see those things. But it's really disheartening, because then we realize that we're further marginalized artists who historically have not always been central to the Western European canon in some ways, or even thinking about our institutions' how they value and privilege certain artworks in general. So when we look at this, we have to understand that encyclopedic American museums, art museums, as many of them were developed in the 19th century, had a nationalistic premise, and that premise was to develop a sense of culture that could revel and mirror that of Western European artworks and museums. And so if we look at those histories, then we see that, okay, then the work of Native peoples, the work of African peoples, the work of peoples of color don't always fit into a context that can complement that sense of national identity. And that's why we see the emergence of institutions. If we look at El Museo, if we look at Studio Museum, that developed in the 1960s and 70s, that are shining a light on the works of people of color, and saying that this work is important, it should be honored, and it should be celebrated and shared. So that practice is historical to our field, and so we have to think about how do we play that out or continue that on a micro level or an individual level as well. And I know sometimes the work just isn't on the floor, right? Sometimes you only have one Jacob Lawrence, or you only have one piece from a contemporary Asian artist. But then that begets the conversation about how then do we get at the table so that our curators and our colleagues know that this work should be seen and people want to see it. Other examples of our interactions with objects include highlighting a single narrative, again, feeding into this idea that we are only looking at or only should value the works of artists that are dominantly white male artists. Again, having the collections reflect their work and their histories, and then avoiding discussions around race, racism, and cultural ownership and influence.
Great, so then the next category is we can think about our interactions with audiences, right? So visitors come in the door and all of a sudden we're teaching or we're putting a program on together, and we start to see that these ideas about racism are filtering through all of those interactions as well. We'll draw your attention to the first one, limited assumptions about audiences' needs. This is one that we hear all the time. A couple examples are somebody turning to you, maybe a colleague that you've just taught with, and saying, oh man, you know, I've got a group coming in next. They're coming from Washington Heights. It's a little rough over there. I don't think we're going to get to do as much as I did with that first group. So maybe I'll only take them to 2 works of art. Or maybe in a different conversation, you're planning out with another colleague, and you start to say, oh, you know what, I'm so excited. You know, I've been building up this relationship with this school. It's predominantly students of color. You know, I think we're just going to go see Kahindi Wiley the whole time, because they'll really get that. right? So you start to see that these different examples are ways in which we as educators are already limiting the sense of possibility of what we can do with a group of students or a group of learners, right? So, oh, I know who you are, then therefore we're just gonna do this. Or, oh, you probably won't be able to handle this, right? So that kind of thinking, like if we start to analyze where that's coming from, we start to see how a lot of that is what's called deficit thinking. So those of you who study education will understand this term as a way of thinking about people from what they lack rather than their assets. Right? And this is something we do subconsciously, so you probably don't even notice that you're doing it. But this kind of deficit thinking runs through a lot of our programs. And we hear it often. I mean, one of the other times I hear it is in arguing with, sometimes with security or curatorial staff about, oh, yeah, the school groups are always the ones touching the works of art. We all know it's the adults touching the works of art. So you start to think about these assumptions are permeating our entire institutions, right? So thinking about the ways in which how we interact with people is really colored by our views on racism. A couple of other examples here are just neutrality and silence around race. Yeah, I don't need to talk about it. No. Oh yeah, that Byron Kim work? Yeah, we don't need to bring up race. You should look up his work. What about English-centered learning experiences? What happens then? Who's left out of that conversation? And what message is that communicating to our learners, our audiences and communities? Also, just limited engagement with people of color. You know what, we're having such a hard time bringing them into the institution. Maybe we need to think about expanding our sense of an institution beyond the walls, right? So, and finally, again, this avoidance of discussions, right? So we're not even gonna talk about racism. So.
And then our interactions with institutions. So the one I really want to highlight is the first one, tokenism in the workplace. And this goes back to our conversation about diversity. Oftentimes I find people will say, I'll ask, you know, oh, how diverse is your docent class? And they say, oh, I've got an Asian person, I've got an elder gay man, and I've got
one person who's half.
One person might be Latino, but he doesn't really look Latino.
Can't really tell.
And so we start to create these like diversity checklists. Like, did I get everybody? Am I doing my job? Oh yeah, we did that. They're here. And really, when we're doing that, it actually just replicates this history of counting people of color that comes out of colonialism. I know, right? Kind of dark, but but it's true. So then, I'm not saying that those people shouldn't be in the room. I would love for there to be more brown and black people in the room. And I think we need those voices there so that we can start to think about how do we connect with diverse audiences and visitors. And I love the word users earlier today. But it becomes problematic when we expect those people to be tokens or to speak for an entire community, or when we only ask them to take on projects and limit them to the scope of the discussion just around their racial identity. What happens when we look at that educator who happens to be a Dominican teaching artist and say, yeah, you speak Spanish and that's wonderful, but guess what? You're also a specialist when it comes to working with children with autism. And you also have this other incredible range of skills that that have nothing to do with your racial identity as well, okay? So how can we broaden the way that we work with these folks so that we're not making them more monolithic? And then if we continue with that, then we have to reassess our hiring practices. We never get tired, I don't know. I'm always tired of hearing, I just can't find any people of color. Where are they? They're not signing up. They're not applying. But we have to step back and think about, well, what are we doing? You know, what strategies are we taking to reach out to build relationships? Not just to send the notice, but to build a relationship of trust that somebody actually wants to work in our institutions. Because sometimes people are saying, you know what, that's not a place for me, and I actually don't want to go there every day and have to deal with certain things. And then with that, when we do recruit people of color, how do we create engaging professional development experiences for them so that they can continue to grow, and also for our white educators and white staff members that focus on anti-racist work so that we can continue to create more inclusive spaces. And then, and I think if we're doing these practices, then we can start to think a little bit more about changing the entire culture of an institution and moving away from this kind of hierarchy of value. So let's get to some practice.
So now we start to think about, well, what do we do about this? You know, so I could see in the dark here a number of people nodding along to these. I heard some sighs and some gasps at some of the examples. So we know we have a lot of work to do, right? So now what do we do? So let's start off with a couple things. One is that in all of the workshops that Keonna and I do, we always talk about setting up structures to talk about race, right? Because this is a conversation that many of us are not trained to have in the workplace. Many people are having it in their personal spaces, in their families and communities. But many people, and particularly white people, are not taught how to talk about race. That's part of how racism is perpetuated, is that we don't even have to think about it as a white person. What we need to do is set up protocols to do it, just like we have protocols for teaching in the gallery. So a couple things here that we'll highlight. The first is that we're really encouraging people to create a brave space and not a safe space. So this is not our terminology, but a number of people who have worked with cross-cultural dialogues have started to use this term brave space as a counterpoint to safety. So oftentimes we'll be like, hey, it'd be great to have a safe conversation about race. No, it wouldn't. Because safety is going to perpetuate generally it perpetuates the comfort of the white people in the room. So what we need is a different kind of conversation that asks for bravery. It's bravery from everybody in the room to step into something that might be challenging.
And also, the reality is that we can't guarantee that any space is ever going to be safe. We don't know what every individual is carrying with them, and we don't know how we can safeguard those experiences that they're carrying so that they never kind of move out into any spaces of discomfort.
So with that, we're thinking about getting out of your comfort zone. And this is something, here we are as educators, right? We spend all of our time asking learners to do uncomfortable things. Look at this work of abstract art. Do some movement experience in front of this object. Like, we are asking people on a daily basis to get uncomfortable, and yet rarely do we do it ourselves. So we think about the reason why we move to that moment of discomfort is because that's when we learn, right? That's why we make our learners do it. That's when you grow. So when we lean into the discomfort of these conversations, that's when we're growing.
And it's important to remember that we have to listen to learn, not to respond. We've all had those conversations where someone's just like ready to go. Or on social media when someone's kind of got like Twitter fingers and they're ready just to respond rather than hearing what that person is saying. But if we are listening to learn, then we can really get to that point of knowing that there's an opportunity to expand our thinking and to trouble something that we might have taken for granted in our own cultural practices and just in our own experiences and lived experiences as well. And so, but when we're doing that, as we're listening and as we start to respond, it's important to remember that we don't want to tone police people either. And so what we mean by tone policing is saying to a person, you really should calm down, or why are you so excited about this, or you seem very angry all the time. And we want to remember that because everyone is dealing with these problems in their own way. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't be accountable for how we communicate with each other. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is, especially when we're talking to people of color, often it actually isn't a physically safe space to convey some of the experiences that we might have living in these bodies, walking through this earth. And so just remembering that we want to make sure that people can share and be vulnerable enough to share so that we can learn and offer that respect in return.
So with that, we're thinking about speaking from your own experience. So really centering our conversations in the I. So this is how I'm experiencing this. This is what I was taught. This is how I was thinking. And really using that as your jumping off point. that can also help us focus on language that expands. So instead of there being one truth, right, there are many possibilities in truth, right? So one of the things we encourage is for us to try and switch the but to an and, right? So instead of saying, well, but I thought it was like this, and I thought it was like this, because it can be both. It can be many.
And finally, understanding that stories stay and lessons leave. So there's a running theme of building trust here in these conversations. And so if you understand that the stories can stay, then that means that when someone is sharing something with you, there's no need for me to go ahead and share the details of Marit's experience with someone else in my institution. But I can extract that lesson and what I've learned from her experience, what she's learned, so that I can apply it to other situations that I might be in and think about them a bit differently without breaking her confidence in me. Okay. So, now.
Yeah. So thinking about then how we actually respond in those moments. So we've set up some protocols, we've set up some ways of thinking about how we enter these conversations. What do we do in the moment? What do you do when that colleague turns to you and says something that you're like, whoa, wait a second? And we just want to flag a couple of these here. We'll speed through these. But the first is to think about your assets. What do you have as strengths in terms of your own communication, in terms of your access to resources, in terms of your own personal experience? And then to ask clarifying questions. So, oh, what did you mean by that? What did you mean when you said you were only going to show this group of students a couple works of art? Tell me more. We use the clarifying questions perhaps often in this field. It's easy to turn it to a different subject.
Mm-hmm. And in those moments when you actually hear something or see something that you realize is offensive or racist, like how do you respond to that? It can be unnerving at times, particularly with whoever that person could be, depending on your relationship with them. But one thing we found to be helpful is to understand that you can validate their presence without validating their comments. So you can engage them in conversation and engage their language and understand the feeling and where they're coming from without validating their comments or agreeing with them in that moment, but to help them think a little bit more critically about what they're saying. I also think it's important for us to really consider how silence or our non-response feeds into validating some of those comments and some of those actions as well. So if we excuse something, if we don't engage it, or we don't critique it or offer a little bit of pushback, we do say, oh, yeah, we normalize it in some ways. We allow it to persist.
Great, so with this, also thinking about a focus on empathy. So this, again, idea of validating the present. So this is a person in front of me, so I can be empathetic to what's happening, but also knowing that I can cut it off. So if this is becoming too heated or we don't see a way out, it's okay to say, you know what, we need to put this aside for now. And that can be with a visitor or with a colleague. And then finally, being honest about what you know and don't know. It's okay to not know something. Again, we do this all the time with our learners, right? Like, it's okay to not know what you see in an image. It's also okay to not know what's happening in an experience. So leaning into those tools that we have as museum educators are ripe for these conversations. And then the last one is just figuring out how to continually bring in marginalized voices and experiences to the conversation. So thinking about this particularly for those of us who work in institutions where it is predominantly white and predominantly white women in the field, we think about there are oftentimes conversations that we're having with white women just together and there are not actually people of color present. It is on us to make sure that we are bringing in as many voices and experiences as possible. So that should be on our radar at all times.
Now, we want to move on to what we can do. So in our first workshop, Marit and I actually asked participants to divide up into affinity groups. And we asked the museum educators of color to work with me, and Marit worked with white educators. We didn't do this because we wanted to water down the conversation or further any type of segregation or dissonance between those participants, but we did it because we understand that people walk through the world with different experiences when it comes to race, and they receive different responses from others based on their racial identity. And so in doing so, we wanted to make sure that white educators had a space where they could fumble and work through some challenging conversations and language, and where educators of color could kind of exhale a little bit and work through some of the challenges that they experience, but also think about how they can troubleshoot some of those things in their own terms. So now we want to give you some things to consider based on your identity and how you identify. So for people of color in the room, I want to tell you to trust yourself and know that you belong here. So often, I've had conversations with my peers who say, I can't believe I'm here. Why do I have to fight so hard to be here? And they have this sense of imposter syndrome. But know that you have made it this far. You are in the room because somewhere along the way, you have validated yourself. And maybe someone else validated you too, but your own sense of validation is far more important. I also want you to know that it's important for us to learn our histories, not only of your particular cultural group, but of other racialized peoples as well. Being able to understand my history as a Black American woman has empowered me so much to feel fluent and confident in having these conversations, whether they're at work or at play. It's helped me be able to go back and find a touchstone for resistance in times when I felt extremely marginalized and times when I almost felt silent. It's armor, and it's important. And being able to look at other people's stories has allowed me to be able to see that this problem and this issue is far bigger than being Black in America. I have empathy for others as well. The other thing I wanted to say was that we need to make sure that we're telling our story. So once you find your history and understand that history, write it down, but also think about your personal story, your lived experience. We are in a very unique space in art museums where we can help people make and share and create and look and discover. And creating art is resistance work. Sharing art is resistance work. And if we don't tell our stories, no one else, maybe they won't get told, or they won't get told in the right way. And then with that, it's important to remember that we don't have to ask for permission to celebrate our culture. And we can celebrate it unapologetically. And we can celebrate ourselves and walk in our bodies unapologetically. So there's no need to ask someone what you can and what you can't do when it comes to your lived experience and your lived culture. I kind of go by this rule. Sorry if anybody used to supervise me in the past, but ask for permission later. Ask for forgiveness later, and just move forward with it, especially if I believe it to be something to be true. I want to also remind you that practicing self-care is going to be extremely important in this work. We're in it for the long haul, so you have to do what you can when you can. But remember that this is not necessarily a problem that is created by us, but it's something that we have to get our hands dirty with to untangle and to start to fix. But it's a long game. We're talking here, we didn't even get into it, but we're talking here, this idea of race is at least 500 years old. So this is a short part in a long marathon of dismantling a system of oppression. And part of our resistance in doing so is making sure that we don't centralize white narratives, white comfort, white silence in our lives, albeit personal or professional. And so that doesn't mean that we're not caring for our friends. That doesn't mean that we aren't showing empathy. But what that does mean is that this internalized sense of inferiority, we're trying to push that out of our minds and out of our spirits and have a space for what we need and articulate that in our shared story so that other people can understand that our values and our experiences are important as well.
All right, for my white friends in the room, which we are many, I really would like to call us to action here. This is on us. So it's time for all of us to step up to the plate on this one. The first thing is what we said is we need to lean hard into that discomfort. We need to stretch ourselves. This is our work to do. And if we're not doing it every day, then we are contributing to the systems of oppression that are the status quo. So I don't care if it's uncomfortable. I am not comfortable right now. So I will tell you this, it is not fun all the time, but that is a privilege that we have to turn it on and off. So I'm going to tell you to turn it on and keep it on as best you can. The next is to do your homework, right? There is plenty out there to teach us about what it means to experience the world in different ways. We're arts educators, people. There's artworks in our buildings that can teach us this, right? There's also this thing called the internet, and people write things on it about their experiences. You can read them. So that way you don't have to pester your friends of color to be like, hey, wait, what's your opinion on Black Lives Matter? Wait, what do you think? Should that officer have been indicted? No. Do the work yourself. All right, so this is on us to do the research. Make sure that we're affirming multiple truths and different ways of knowing. Anytime you start to have that sense of like, oh, well, no, this is the way to do it, try and block that mode of thinking. There are other ways of doing things, and they actually might be better than the ways we've been doing it. Trust people of color, please. I joked to Keonna that I was going to wear a T-shirt today that just said, please listen to Keonna, and I was just going to stand here. And it's only half a joke, because white people, we do not trust people of color enough. If somebody comes to you and says, you know what, this label text feels a little funny, or, hey, I felt a little strange vibe from that group that came in, or, you know, that teacher talked to me in a way that felt different than how she talked to you, Marit. Trust what your colleagues are telling you. It's real. Remember back to that slide? Racism is real. This stuff is happening. So with that, don't be so defensive. All right? So oftentimes as white people, we're so afraid of hurting our colleagues, our friends, right? I'm sure in our relationship, I have said countless things to hurt Keonna. Not intentionally. See, it's true. I can think of several right now. And in those moments, my reaction is always, oh, I didn't mean that. Like, oh, I didn't want you to be hurt. I wasn't trying to be a racist. I wasn't trying to say something that exerted my white supremacy over you. However, I did. And so that moment is a moment for me to learn. And so recognizing that when I start to have that instinct of like, oh, no, wait, back, not what I meant. As soon as I start to notice I'm doing that, because we notice when we're doing it, I need to stop and lean in. That's when I need to listen. Can you help me understand what I just did? Or maybe let me go home and do my homework and understand what I just did. With that, recognizing how much is at stake when colleagues of color bring up race. Their speaking up is an act of care and radical love for us, right? So when Keonna agrees to do these workshops with me, it is an act of love that she's trusting me also. And when she calls me out and says, like, actually, you got that part wrong, or like, you know what, when you said this, that actually kind of hurt me, that takes courage. That takes bravery. And it takes more bravery than it takes for me, because I am in a position of power. And so for white people, we need to understand that sometimes when somebody is saying something to you that makes you feel like, I can't believe they called me out for that, understand that being called out is actually an invitation from your colleagues of color and a sense that they trust and love and care for you. Finally, with this, thinking back to this idea of we need to speak up for injustice every moment we can. So it's not just when Keonna is in the room with me so that I look good next to her. It's when I'm with colleagues who are all white. It's when I'm with colleagues who all look like me or share similar experiences. I need to even be more aggressive then, because that's when it's more likely that those multiple truths are going to be forgotten.
So we encourage you to do something in your sphere of influence, whether that's within your institutions or outside of it. And we wanted to point out there are many people in our field who are doing real and important work pertaining to issues of racism and trying to dismantle it in any way they can. And so if we're all chipping away, we'll end up making a very big dent and break here. And so we wanted to point out a couple of conversations that are happening across the nation. This is not exhaustive. If you dig and share, you can find that there are many other programs being implemented to really address these issues. So they include Museum Respond to Ferguson. If you follow them on Twitter with Alea Brown and
Anthea Whitman.
Oh, sorry, inclusive. And you can respond to them. They often have Twitter chats that you can join, dealing with current events and issues and how museums can stay relevant in their response to those. Brown Girls Museum blog is also a great site to look at and see personal reflections, as well as larger contextual conversations around race, identity, and other intersections of social issues. The Incluseum is a great blog site, and also a great space to highlight your program and your programmatic work. I think they're doing a wonderful job of documenting what's going on in the field. Visitors of Color Tumblr is a good space to also hear from people of color, artists, students of various ages, and understand their experiences in different museums. The Mass Action was a recent convening that will be going on for the next 3 years of over 50 museum educators who are looking to think about a holistic plan to start to offer our field tools for really creating more inclusive spaces. So not just focusing on race, but thinking about ability, gender, and equity across the board. The Journal of Museum Education has an upcoming focus on race and racism in museum education that will be coming out this spring, and we definitely encourage you guys to read that. And the Museum Workers Speak is really thinking about issues. I have a few, a lot of these people also are in the room too. Mm-hmm. Sorry, if you're like in the room and you hear your project being called, just raise your hand or touch out to somebody. But thinking about issues with Museum Workers Speak of equity and pay and the economics of our work, who gets to participate and who doesn't get to participate based on money. And then Museum Hue, I think I saw some people in the back there. They are really thinking about making sure that we understand that people of color want to be in our spaces, and how can we connect people of color to institutions so that they can continue to diversify and be more inclusive.
Yeah. So great. So all of this conversation today and some of these strategies, as Keonna pointed out, it's really a cyclical process, right? So it's constantly revisiting our vocabulary. It's constantly setting up ways to analyze what really happened when we encounter racism. And it's calling each other in and really supporting each other through our own identities and through the stances that we bring to our work. With that, though, what we really need to think about is how these actions, in changing our actions, can also change the values that we bring to our work. So I ask you as we kind of close out here to think about what values brought you to museum education. Why did you end up in this room? And I think for a lot of us, they might center around things like, well, I really value arts and culture. I love the objects that artists and artworks tell, or the stories that they tell, right? Or maybe it's about the people. I love those interactions, those great questions that I have with a visitor when they come in, right? Or what it means to make a work of art in a gallery next to a primary source, right? Or maybe you're really into the learning, right? You just like watching when a young student has an aha moment, right? All of these are, and I'm just the tip of the iceberg on what some of the values that bring us to this work. But what we need to do is think about how these values now interlace with our move to dismantle racism. So that when we start to think about how much we love arts and culture, right? And how much we love the object, how much we love that work of art, we're starting to think about, well, wait, we need to expand our vision of which artwork we're loving, right? And make sure that we're encountering all of the different perspectives that can come in through an analysis of a work of art, right? So it becomes more expansive. Likewise, when we're thinking about the people that we're interested in, right? So when we start to think about like, oh yeah, I came into this field because I value people. If you value people, then you absolutely have to be doing anti-racist work if you do this work in this field. Because to value people means to value them as holistic, full creatures walking into your space in relation with you, and they are bringing a whole host of emotions and reactions and oppressions with them. So we need to do what we can to encounter and meet people where they are in their whole person, right? And then finally, with this idea of loving the learning, right? So for those of us who came in here loving the learning, right? If you're going to love the learning, you got to do it through an anti-racist lens if you're really going to do it, because that's where we're going to really transform how people think about themselves and their relations to each other and to our society. So really this move towards anti-racist work is a deepening of our values of what brought us here. Oh, sorry, I skipped over Malcolm.
And I think when we start thinking about our values, we can start seeing that we actually experience our own transformation. A lot of times we talked about having these transformative experiences with our audiences, for them, but we have to also think about them for ourselves, because that is inherent in the love of learning. I know for myself, in thinking about being more active in my anti-racist practice, it's allowed me to open up my purview so that I can see other people's experiences more clearly. It's allowed me to recognize and empathize, but also act and affirm their identities, particularly when I think about identities, conversations around gender expression, and identity and sexuality, which I'm still continuing to grow and learn and explore more deeply. But if I realize that I have to, as I realize I have to speak up for those people, I realize that I'm also speaking up for myself. Because if I'm not standing in silence for anyone else's oppression, I'm also standing in silence for my own.
And I think for me, one of the ways in which I've felt my values deepen and align more with anti-racist work in these conversations and workshops with Keonna is thinking about, though I may have entered the work thinking about how I could use art and encounters with museums and education as a space to provide liberation for other people, that actually my own liberation and my own equality and my own ability to be who I really am is tied up in the fact that there are people of color, there are people who are oppressed in our society who are not able to be their full selves. So I won't be free until they're free. So understanding that my values that originally brought me into this field are actually must be deepened by committing to anti-racist work, and in doing so, bring me to a place where I can be more full myself.
Oops. So we're going to go off and practice now. We have 2 afternoon sessions. And as you go off, you're going to feel exhausted. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be tired. You're going to be anxious. You're going to feel encouraged and engaged, and you're going to connect with people as well, and go through this range of emotions. But stick with it. Stay going. Move forward. And continue to ask yourself, what can you do today to shift your value and to think about one anti-racist step you can do today? And once you think about today, think about what can you do next week? What's one way you can work towards being more anti-racist in your practice and values next week? And from there, consider, okay, now how do I make that programmatic? How do I allow that practice to seep in to my work with learners and colleagues, maybe leaders, and even policy? What are those 3 ways that you can make a deep impact? We believe you guys can do it. You're here, and this is a great start to a terrific day of discovery. We want to thank you for your time with us, and we are encouraged to continue the conversation now and throughout the day at various breakout groups and at lunch if you want to continue it further. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Good job.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
thank you both so much for giving us quite a lot to, like you were saying, absorb, think about, and consider how we can put a lot of these ideas and concepts into practice. So thank you both very, very much for sharing those different ideas. So now it's time to transition into the next portion of the day. In your registration envelopes, you will have been told what your gallery breakout session is, including where it is in the museum. There is a map enclosed in your folder as well. So there's about 10 minutes for you to make your way into the galleries. And as Keonna and Marit were saying, please consider a lot of these ideas, terms, and thinking about connections to your own work. Thank you very much.